engines screaming at full military power. The Sabres slice through thin air at 35,000 feet as Captain Daniel Harper shoves the throttle forward, knuckles white inside his gloves, because this was never supposed to turn into a fight. This was supposed to be his last clean run before rotation home. One more escort, one more box checked, then a seat on a transport and a quiet drink stateside. Yet the warning lights in his head are already flashing as 8 silver shapes punch upward from beyond the river line, climbing hard out of forbidden airspace. And Harper knows instantly that something is wrong, deeply wrong, because enemy fighters don't come up like this anymore. Not since winter doctrine shifted to tight elements and controlled engagements. Not since the instructors stopped teaching head-on bravado and started teaching survival. But these aircraft are coming straight in. Noses level, no feints, no altitude trap. Just raw closure speed like men who either don't know the rules or don't care if they live long enough to follow them. And Harper feels that cold weight in his stomach, the same one he felt months earlier over a frozen valley when a lone enemy pilot charged a bomber stream with a dead radio and a death wish, and that man had died screaming into the clouds. So Harper snaps the command to brake, yanks the stick before thought can catch up to instinct, trusting muscle memory more than hope. His wingman glued to his move while the second element stays with the bomb-laden strike planes. And now the sky fractures into motion as the enemy commits, closing too fast, too straight, and Harper turns into them, not away, stealing angles from speed, because this fight is never about who climbs better or accelerates harder at altitude. He knows that math by heart. The enemy jets win it every time. This fight is about who survives when the airframe starts to protest, who can pull until the world grays at the edges and the jet still holds together. And Harper's aircraft does, screaming but intact. And 3 enemy fighters overshoot in a blur of silver and vapor. 2 try to stay with him and bleed energy like coins spilling from torn pockets. 1 pitches straight up in a desperate vertical escape that would have worked if he'd entered with more speed. But he didn't. And Harper sees it all in fragments while his wingman shouts about threats reforming behind them. Yet Harper's eyes lock on the hanging aircraft above him, frozen for half a heartbeat at the top of its climb, helpless, weightless, a diagram in a training manual made real. And when Harper squeezes the trigger, the cockpit fills with that awful tearing sound, like cloth being ripped apart, a sound he has never gotten used to no matter how many missions he's flown. And the enemy jet doesn't explode heroically. It simply disassembles, panels, wing sections, canopy separating in clean, terrible pieces. And Harper watches for the telltale sign he's learned to recognize, the one that tells him who he's really fighting in these skies. But the canopy never pops, no ejection, just a body carried down with the wreckage. And the realization lands heavy as the radio chatter surges back and the fight rolls on around him. Because that detail matters, because it always means the same thing. And as Harper pulls through the debris cloud, heart hammering, he knows this kill will change the tone of everything that follows. Not just today, but the next encounter and the one after that. Because patterns are breaking, rules are being ignored, and the enemy is getting desperate. And this moment, this single hanging aircraft torn apart in silence, is the hinge on which the rest of the story will turn. The warning tone cuts through the cockpit like a knife as Harper snaps his head left. The sky suddenly too crowded. His wingman shouting that the 2 enemy fighters he lost earlier aren't disengaging, aren't fleeing north like disciplined pilots are supposed to do. They're rolling in behind him, patient, hunting, and Harper glances at the ammo counter stuck at 184 rounds, frozen there like it has been since pre-flight. A number he knows is a lie because he felt the recoil earlier, felt the aircraft shudder through a long burst that had to eat half that reserve. But he ignored the jammed gauge because this was meant to be his final mission, because he wanted the sortie to mean something, because Captain Daniel Harper from a factory town outside Dayton, Ohio, was never meant to end up here at all, let alone as the only fighter pilot in this war who would ever climb to that impossible number. And the irony bites hard as he rolls inverted and pulls, because Harper wasn't even supposed to be a pilot. Not back when he joined the Army Air Forces in 1941 chasing the prestige slots, navigator school, the thinking man's aircrew position, the one that didn't get headlines but kept bombers alive. Except Harper couldn't stop looking outside, couldn't trust dead reckoning and star charts alone, kept checking rivers and rail lines because numbers felt abstract, but terrain felt real. And the instructors wrote him off fast, aptitude insufficient, eyes wandering, judgment flawed, so they shoved him into a tail turret instead. B-17S over Germany, cold metal, flak bursts blooming like black flowers. And Harper survived his tour by reacting faster than men who trusted procedures more than instinct. Came home, reapplied, got ignored, reapplied again, drowned in a sea of rejected hopefuls until a clerk noticed the combat hours logged backwards in a bomber and slid his file into a stack. No one was watching closely. Mustang training needed bodies in late 1944. Harper took the slot, earned his wings just in time for the war to end before he fired a single shot, then spent years flying meaningless patrols, air shows, alerts that never launched, watching younger men pass him by while jets arrived and left him behind, rejected again and again for lacking combat relevance, until June 1950 ripped the world open and suddenly experience of any kind mattered. Korea turning cold and lethal overnight. Harper deploying in early jets that couldn't touch the enemy climbing above them. Months of being outclassed, outclimbed, outturned, learning survival instead of victory. Then finally rotating home just before the new Sabres arrived. Exile to Alaska. Endless gray skies. Intercept drills against bombers that never came, 14 applications to return to combat, 12 refusals, 2 silences, and 1 acceptance, only because too many pilots hadn't come back that winter. And Harper arrived back in theater older than most, carrying a reputation for failure stitched to persistence, assigned to safe escort duty because no one trusted a zero-kill pilot with MiG hunting, logging mission after mission where nothing happened while the calendar burned down. Knowing he had barely 3 months before rotation, knowing this was likely his last chance to ever matter in a war that had passed him twice already, and now as the enemy closes in behind him, as the counter lies and the fuel ticks down, Harper understands that everything before this moment, the washouts, the turrets, the rejections, the quiet bases, was compression, pressure building, because wars don't reward clean resumes. They reward men who stay long enough for luck to finally notice them. And as he rolls to meet the threat he can't see yet, heart hammering, jaw tight, Harper realizes that this spring will either erase him completely or carve his name into history faster than anyone will believe possible. January air knifes down through the canopy on Harper's 5th combat mission when the warning finally comes too late. 2 enemy fighters dropping out of the sun at 32,000 feet, perfectly placed, perfectly timed, and Harper knows immediately this is on him because he's staring at the bomber formation instead of the glare above. Escort duty dulling his edge, teaching his eyes to protect instead of hunt. And when his wingman yells "break right," Harper reacts wrong, snaps left, bleeds speed, hands the advantage away in one smooth, disastrous motion, and the lead enemy jet slides in behind him like it's been rehearsed. Guns already walking toward his tail. Violet-white tracers slicing past close enough that Harper can see the spacing between rounds, can feel the weight of them even without impact, because these aren't machine guns, they're cannons, the kind that end fights instantly. One hit anywhere enough to turn a cockpit into a coffin, and Harper hauls back harder, doing exactly what every briefing says not to do, slow and tight against an aircraft that loves vertical space, and for 3 seconds, maybe 4. His life narrows to the idea that this is how his name ends up stenciled on a board back at base, missing, presumed dead. Except the firing stops, abruptly, unnaturally, the enemy jet pitching straight up and away with a clean escape, leaving Harper alive and shaking in thin air. And only after they land does his wingman explain what really happened, how the second enemy fighter drifted out of position and the leader couldn't confirm separation. How their doctrine forbade finishing the shot without certainty. How discipline mattered more than opportunity. And Harper doesn't believe it until he watches the gun camera footage frame by frame, his own film showing the enemy perfectly lined up, solution locked, trigger discipline overriding bloodlust. And that detail gnaws at him because it reveals something deeper, something structural. That the other side fights under a different gravity. Their cameras always running. Their claims meaningless without proof. Their pilots punished not for missing but for firing without documentation. And Harper realizes that somewhere north of the river, a man probably paid for letting him live. And that debt sits heavy through the rest of February, as Harper flies 7 more missions that teach him frustration instead of victory. Brief flashes of silver at altitude. One rushed burst fired too far outside the radar site's parameters. Bullets arcing harmlessly through empty sky because escort flying trains reaction, not restraint. And when February 16th arrives, the ambush repeats, but Harper is finally ahead of it, reversing into the dive before anyone calls it, forcing the attacker to overshoot, pulling lead the way the manuals describe but don't teach, firing just long enough to see sparks crawl along the enemy's tail, smoke trailing as the MiG flees north, and Harper chases until the river cuts him off, the invisible line that ends careers and starts courts-martial, forced to peel away while the damaged jet limps into sanctuary, alive, uncounted. And when Harper lands, he is incandescent with rage, not fear this time, but clarity, understanding that escort missions have been sanding him down into something passive, something that waits. And wars don't crown survivors, they crown hunters. And whether the squadron commander saw it in the footage or felt it in Harper's voice doesn't matter, because in March the orders change, the bombers disappear from his briefings, and Harper is reassigned to pure patrol. Empty sky ahead, full tanks, live ammunition, nothing to protect except his element, and nothing to do but climb toward the river and look for silver shapes rising to meet him. 16 victories in 72 days sounds like mythology, until you strip the calendar down to what actually happened. Because Harper didn't dominate the sky every time he flew. He waited, endured, learned, and then compressed an entire war into 12 violent conversations that ended with wreckage falling north of the river. 12 real fights out of more than 100 sorties where most missions were nothing but empty air and radio chatter. And when the moment came, he made it count brutally fast, sometimes more than once in the same stretch of sky. And April 12th was the day the pattern broke wide open when Harper's patrol intercepted 7 enemy jets, clawing their way up from a forward field near the border, stacked in textbook layers, pairs guarding altitude bands with a lone leader floating above like a chess piece. Everyone was supposed to protect, and doctrine screamed to decapitate the top man, to collapse the formation by killing the brain. But Harper ignored it, dove instead on the middle pair turning away. Pilots who hadn't even realized they'd been found yet, and the burst was calm, deliberate. 4 seconds that didn't light the target on fire but folded its wing upward like a broken limb. Hydraulics gone, aircraft snapping inverted. The pilot punching out just in time to watch his machine die without him. And Harper was already moving, because hesitation kills more pilots than bullets. The second enemy tried to run straight downhill, an error born of panic. And Harper followed with the Sabre's one true gift, speed in the dive, closing to ranges most men fired from instinctively, but he waited, forced himself to wait, until 600 feet felt uncomfortably intimate, then held the trigger long enough that the canopy shattered before the jet understood it was dead. No ejection this time, just a nose dropping into a terminal spin. And Harper broke away immediately because the sky was still crowded. The top patrol leader finally diving. Chaos spreading exactly the way doctrine said it would, but too late, and the third kill came unplanned when another MiG crossed between them at the worst possible angle, the straggler drifting into Harper's sights like fate misstepping. A reflex squeeze, 2 seconds, and this one didn't disassemble or bleed smoke. It vanished in a violent white-orange bloom that punched debris through the air. Gone so completely it barely felt real, and the clock later said the entire fight lasted 11 minutes. 3 kills, 0 rounds left, and that rhythm continued through late April and into May. Victories stacking in brief, ferocious intervals separated by days of nothing. Records thinning out as the details vanished into paper archives and unscanned reports, leaving only totals and rumors, like the ground crew superstition about Harper's scarf. A plain silk thing washed religiously after every successful mission, forgotten twice and followed both times by empty skies. A coincidence everyone believed in except Harper himself, who wore it anyway because survival in combat has always included appeasing the people who keep your aircraft alive. And by the start of May, the number had climbed to 15 and command wanted him gone, not for safety but for optics, because aces die loudly and surviving legends are easier to manage from a desk. Orders cut, rotation looming, Harper arguing for just a little more sky, 2 extra missions granted, 1 uneventful, the last on May 18th. The escort that should have been simple, the one where enemy formations stopped obeying their own logic, and 8 jets charged head-on like men who hadn't been taught better yet, where Harper scored number 16 and nearly paid for it because a faulty gauge lied about how much fight he had left. And the broader truth sat beneath it all, that the machines mattered less than the men inside them, that the enemy aircraft climbed faster, turned tighter, hit harder, yet lost because their pilots kept rotating out just as they learned how Americans actually fought, while Harper stayed, adapted, and hunted through. By the spring of that year, the airwaves themselves were changing, the clipped calm of disciplined brevity codes dissolving into long, frightened sentences, and the American listening stations on the islands off the coast were quietly recording entire engagements in Russian, voices rising, overlapping, pilots asking for help they were never supposed to request, naming positions, breaking every rule they'd been trained to live by because they were suddenly alone, and the man who was supposed to be watching their back was already dead. And Harper's wingman caught pieces of it, not fluent, but fluent enough to hear the difference between one enemy and many, between confidence and fear. A single word that decided whether a MiG stayed to fight or fled north. And Harper listened too, learning without ever speaking, then began to bend that fear deliberately, splitting his element wide, showing just enough separation to make the enemy think they had the numbers, waiting for the tone on the radio to shift, for the Russian voices to tighten and multiply, then collapsing back together at the exact moment the MiGs realized they'd misread the sky. April 7th unfolding exactly like that, when a lone enemy pilot announced he saw 1 Sabre and committed to a head-on pass, never looking back, never questioning why the geometry felt wrong, flying straight into Harper's guns while another American sat 4,000 feet above, invisible, and the camera later caught the canopy tearing free as the pilot ejected, alive but finished, likely carried back across the river, interrogated, debriefed, reduced to a report that never used Harper's name, but described an American in a silver fighter with red markings, a phrase that would repeat itself through the spring in documents that surfaced decades later when archives cracked open and historians stitched together fragments. 7 separate after-action reports describing the same aircraft, the same behavior, the same lethal impatience. And the Soviets noticed the markings early. Red stars accumulating below the cockpit of an otherwise bare metal jet, a visual signature that began to mean danger before anyone knew who sat inside it. One April 18th report, written by a shaken wingman describing how the American with many red stars destroyed 2 MiGs in under a minute while he himself never fired a shot because he lost his leader in the chaos, admitting in careful language that the enemy did not fight the way intelligence said he should, that he stayed level, refused vertical separation, kept his wingman close, trading geometry for speed, and every countermaneuver drilled into them pushed their aircraft exactly into his firing line. Another report in early May noting an American who waited far too long to shoot, dangerously close, 600 feet or less, close enough that debris could tear his own jet apart, yet devastating because at that distance the bullets punched through armor meant to stop longer-range fire. One pilot describing 17 impacts, 11 penetrations, total hydraulic failure, barely making it home, writing that the American appeared suddenly from below, a place MiG pilots couldn't see without craning downward, and Harper leaned into that blind spot, climbing slow beneath them, patient, letting them maneuver, letting them commit, then pulling up into a firing solution that arrived too late to escape, a tactic so effective it poisoned their awareness, forcing them to scan obsessively below until they forgot to look anywhere else. And Harper punished that too, killing from above once they'd trained themselves to fear the underside. And then there's the report from mid-May that almost says his name without knowing it. A Soviet flight encountering 2 Sabres, the lead American marked with many red victories, recognized instantly, the Soviet leader ordering an immediate disengagement, refusing combat outright, his wingmen disobeying, charging anyway, and dying for it. Because by then the war had reached the point where experience recognized danger faster than doctrine, and the two surviving enemy fighters bolt north and claw their way across the river. And somewhere later, a recommendation gets typed into a Soviet debrief stating plainly that pilots should be warned about specific American hunters and disengage immediately when identified. A recommendation that dies on a desk because acknowledging individual danger means admitting the other side produces better men, not just better machines. And that shatters the entire story Moscow once told. So the paper is rejected and the replacements keep coming south ignorant and confident. And the calendar flips back to May 18th, where Harper is already committed to a decision most pilots wouldn't make with enemies on their tail, his ammunition counter still frozen at a comforting lie, while his instincts scream otherwise, his wingman turning in hard to defend him while Harper does the opposite, pushing the throttle through the gate and pointing straight ahead into open sky, a shallow dive to build speed, dragging the MiGs with him like hooks in water. Watching the airspeed needle climb past 540, 560, 580, waiting for the moment the geometry flips. Because up high, the enemy owns straight-line performance, but down low the rules change, and Harper keeps pulling them lower, past 20,000 feet, past 15, where the MiGs start to feel wrong. Engines breathing harder, controls softening, the promised speed bleeding away. And by 12,000 feet, Harper levels at over 600 knots, and feels the balance shift as the MiGs stop gaining, one of them firing a long, angry burst that never comes close, the other pitching up instinctively to reclaim altitude and advantage. A mistake Harper has been waiting for, because he snaps into the turn with everything the airframe will give him, an 8G pull that crushes the world into gray for a heartbeat. And when his vision comes back, the climbing MiG is framed cleanly ahead, but farther than he likes. Farther than his habits allow, and Harper knows this might be the last chance he gets. The counter useless, the belt nearly empty, the second enemy already repositioning. So he fires anyway. A short, controlled burst at 1,100 feet, while the sight complains and the math says no, and he sees the flashes. Unmistakable impacts crawling across the fuselage, enough to wound, but not enough to finish. The MiG staggering upward out of reach as his guns fall silent, and the truth finally arrives in the form of an empty trigger. The second MiG swinging back in just as Harper's wingman finally slots into position. Two Sabres suddenly visible where one had been, and that's enough. The attacker breaking away instantly and running north while the damaged jet limps across the river, alive, uncounted. And Harper knows with a bitter clarity that if the counter had told the truth, he'd have closed another 200 feet and written a different ending. But wars don't grade on what-ifs. They grade on wreckage, and his final combat mission ends not with a star added, but with fuel fumes, hot metal ticking as it cools, and the quiet understanding that he survived the last fight by inches, not skill. Landing back at Suwon with empty guns, a silk scarf dark with sweat, and 16 kills that will never feel as clean or as complete as the 17th he almost took with him out of the sky. Harper barely speaks during the final debrief, because there's nothing to add that the film doesn't already show. Bright flashes crawling along a climbing enemy fuselage that never quite crosses the line from damage to destruction, and the board rules the way it always does. Hits don't count, intentions don't count, only wreckage on the ground, and the earlier kill from that mission stands as number 16, clean and final. Everything else dissolving into numbers no one will ever read again. And within days the war is physically behind him. A transport lifting him to Japan on May 20th, another flight carrying him home 5 days later. His combat finished not with ceremony but with paperwork. And then the Air Force discovers his new purpose, not as a hunter but as a symbol. A triple ace they can move from podium to podium, shaking hands under banners, selling bonds, smiling for cameras, repeating lines that sound like gratitude but feel hollow in his mouth, because usefulness has changed shape, and he endures it for months while quietly filing applications for test pilot school. The only place left where flying still means learning something real. And when acceptance finally comes, he disappears into the desert at Edwards. Dry air, long runways, no enemy except physics. Assigned to a new variant of a familiar aircraft, heavier, stronger, meant to haul bombs instead of chase silver shapes. And Harper flies it the only way he knows how. Probing limits, asking questions with control inputs, until an August morning turns routine into irreversible when the hydraulics quit just after takeoff. Controls going dead. The nose sagging toward the ground with no argument left in it. Altitude unwinding too fast for calculation. And Harper reaches for the ejection handle knowing the math doesn't favor him. Knowing the seat needs more sky than he has. But pulling anyway because pilots are trained to choose the only option left even when it's wrong. And the sequence begins but doesn't finish. The canopy refusing to clear. The seat firing upward into unyielding plexiglass. The impact fatal before separation can even happen. A failure so mechanical and indifferent it takes 6 weeks to explain in careful language. Reports listing fatigue and timing and tolerances. As if those words can account for a man who survived everything the war could throw at him, only to be killed by a fraction of an inch of plastic. 31 years old, 16 victories, gone 4 months after leaving combat, buried with full honors while his wife accepts a folded flag and a future that shrinks overnight. 3 children growing up with the simple truth that their father died testing an airplane. A truth that explains nothing about the winter skies over the river or the spring mornings when radios filled with Russian voices. And what remains of Harper exists mostly in objects. A scarf behind glass, a flight suit, a logbook where the handwriting tightens and the words disappear once the killing starts. Missions reduced to dates and hours, as if detail itself became dangerous. Except for one entry that breaks the pattern. April 12th, 3 enemies destroyed. 11 minutes of violence summarized with good day. 2 words that say more than any interview ever did. And years later, when former enemies finally spoke freely, when archives cracked and pilots compared memories, they never said his name because they never knew it. They spoke instead of a silver fighter marked in red, of relief when it stopped appearing, of a presence that bent fights in directions they couldn't predict. And somewhere in that absence is the closest thing to an ending this story gets. A war that moved on. Men who grew old. And one pilot whose entire legacy fits between a frozen ammo counter and a quiet note in a logbook that treats extraordinary violence as just another day worth surviving.